Welcome to our Chapter 4 discussion regarding social cognition and person perception. So social cognition just means how do we think when we are in the presence of others. So some of the questions we're going to focus on are how can our schemas unconsciously influence our thinking and behavior? Another question will be, in what way are heuristics an illustration of human beings' capacity for useful thinking versus stupid thinking? The third one might be, how might our beliefs about the stability of personality traits, such as intelligence, relate to our own academic achievement? The next one is, why do people from individualist cultures tend to explain others' actions as being caused by their personalities more so than by their own situation? So the definition of social cognition is the way we interpret, analyze, remember, and use information about our social world. So always keep in mind, whenever it says social cognition, that just means mental processes during a social environment. And we might categorize other people. A category is mental groupings of objects, ideas, or events that share common properties. So the most representative member of a category is what's known as the prototype. For most human beings, they categorize in order to stop what is known as information overload. So categorization can lead to mistakes, though, in our judgment. Another term that I'd like to acquaint you with is what's called the schema. That's our organized structure of knowledge. It's built from our experiences. It contains causal relations and can be a theory about how the social world operates. So people with expertise on a topic have a well-developed schema about that topic. Closely related is what's known as gender schema, and that's the cognitive structure for processing information according to our perceived maleness or femaleness. So the use of gender schema reinforces social stereotypes about gender. Not everyone is gender schematic, though. And this is related to what is known as scripts. So scripts are schemas about events in well-known situations. So learning scripts can be quite an important part of our socialization process. Schema activation says once a schema is activated, we see more information consistent with our schema. We process the information more quickly, and schemas can be activated outside of our conscious awareness. And we see this term down below here as an example related to schemas can being activated. That can be called priming. And priming just means prepare. The next one is called heuristics. And that's the rules of thumb that the people have that help them save time and conserve their mental energy. It might be reasonably, but not extremely accurate. A heuristic, a good example is when people say, well, whenever this happens, this is what I usually do. So what are the specific kinds of heuristics? The first type is representativeness. That says that something is likely to belong to the category if it resembles the category prototype. The second type of heuristic is called availability. So something is likely to occur or is more common if we can easily think of an example. The next type is called anchoring and adjustment. That's when a person says, my estimate of a numerical value is influenced by a number, even if an unrelated number I hear before I make the estimate. So here's a list of answers here. If someone says, when do we use heuristics? So please feel free to pause the video and look at all these answers here. Okay, so we're going to talk about biases. And there is a type of bias known as hindsight. That means after the fact. So when someone says, oh, I always knew that, even though they really didn't know that all the time, but they are saying that they did know that after the fact. There's something called counterfactual thinking, and that's our tendency to evaluate the events by imagining alternative versions or outcomes. And that can help us avoid future problems. It helps us to feel better, but it can be counterproductive after trauma. So how do we form impressions of others? That is due to what we call person perception. And person perception is the process by which we try to detect other people's temporary states and their enduring predispositions. And there are certain types of nonverbal behaviors that we're going to talk about. So nonverbal communication means sending and receiving information using gestures, expressions, vocal cues, and body movements rather than words. So facial expressions, there's a lot listed here. Feel free to pause the video and look at these answers here and examples. So our facial expressions, more often than not, they signal our intentions to others, their emotions. And bodily movements, that's our posture and motion, they convey social information. So we might often subtly mimic the movements of others, even though we don't know we're doing it. We might mimic, and that can cause us to begin to like the person or the situation. And that means non-conscious mimicry. So sometimes it's not, we don't consciously make the decision to mimic others, but we might find that we did when we looked at it after the fact. Okay, another verbal cue is our social role, and that's a cluster of socially defined expectations for behavior in a situation. So in 1987, the researcher, his name was Eagly, he told us about social role theory. And social roles in many societies differ between men and women. Women are more often socialized to pay attention to nonverbal communication than men. Feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to gain a little more insight into this. This has to do with detecting deception from others. And at the bottom here, you'll see that we say we get better at detecting lying the longer we know someone. Next, we'll be talking about implicit personality theories, and that's making naive assumptions about certain types of people. And you see in types here, those are in quotes. So people who believe personalities are fixed are more influenced by implicit personality theories than those who believe that traits can grow. Okay, another type of bias here is confirmation bias. That's the tendency to seek out confirming information and avoid disconfirming information. So once people form an impression, they tend to seek to confirm it. And that can help them perpetuate incorrect stereotypes about others. Next, we're talking about attributions, and that's the way that we explain the cause of an event or behavior. So there is the locus of causality, and there are two types. There is internal attribution, and there is external attribution. And we will go a little bit further about those. So attributions basically refers to when something is occurring, to what do we attribute this person's behavior or those persons' behavior. So attributions are made based on multiple observations of others' behavior. And this is based on the covariation model of attributions. So we're saying that causes are assessed based on behaviors, consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. So attributions that we make internally are more likely consensus and distinctiveness, and they are low, and consistency is high. So when we are attributing one's thoughts and behaviors, we can be guilty of engaging in fundamental attribution error. That's the tendency to underestimate situational factors in explaining the behavior. So another type of bias in attribution is what's known as actor-observer effect. That explains why one's own behaviors as owing to a situation, while others' behavior, it might be the same behavior, is explained as, well, it is owing to their personality or disposition. We're going to talk about the dual process model of attributions. And first attributions they tend to be automatic and simple. But the second attributions, they are a little more deliberate and effortful. So the individual might correct their first judgments. And if they are cognitively busy, this process might not even take place because they're too busy to engage in that. So summarizing this chapter, there's a few questions here. Feel free to pause the slide and look at the questions and think about that. Look for the answers in your research. More questions to consider here. And once again, more questions to consider. So feel free to pause the video and look at these and think about these and engage in some research that will help you to answer these questions. More questions and scenarios to consider. This is our final video for this chapter, and there's more questions to consider. These will be really helpful for you to prepare for quizzes, exams, or general knowledge acquisition. So thank you for joining us. See you for the next chapter.